All right, are we ready? Turn your mic ready? So this year's theme, Recharge, spawned off from last year. When we started Derbycon, when you first walk into the Hyatt and the smell before we all get here, and then just kidding, I mean, we're fine. But when we leave here, we always felt recharged, like hey, we can go on and tackle things and do things better, and that's the reason why this year's theme was here. And so when we're looking at the keynotes, who better to have than two individuals that have dedicated a lot of their time and effort to spawning a whole different vertical that a lot of us now are experts in, both from everything from being a sysadmin all the way to security researchers, all the way to being on offense and defense and securing ourselves. And so I'd like to introduce Jeff Snover as well as Lee Holmes, who are from Microsoft. And Jeff is essentially the founder of PowerShell. So. Also known as the father of PowerShell, right?
Yeah.
So,
much preferred over the grandfather of PowerShell. Not so happy about that one.
I wasn't going to make any old jokes today, so
okay. Good.
And then Lee as well, from a contribution standpoint and skyrocketing PowerShell and what we do from a contribution. But they're known for a lot more and a lot of things that they work on at Microsoft. But their dedication, I mean, PowerShell just went open source is on GitHub now, so that was amazing. So you could run on Linux. I know when it first got up there, the first thing I did was get PowerShell on Linux and then remove PowerShell from Linux. But but it's one of those things where somebody that uses it on a daily basis, both for offense and defense. The contributions they made to this industry is great. So I'd like to introduce them to Derbycon and give them a warm welcome for our opening keynotes. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks, Lee. What a deal.
Sorry, it's my fault.
Electrifying. So howdy, I'm Jeffrey Snover. I'm a Microsoft Technical Fellow, and I'm just thrilled to be here at my first Derbycon.
Yeah! Hey, I'm Lee Holmes. I'm a security architect at Microsoft. And Dave, thanks for the introduction. It's really an honor to be here. Everybody says that, but it's true. This is Derbycon, right? Like, where you go to BarCon and the talks are often as good as the stuff that you see, and you go to LobbyCon and it's awesome. You go outside and every single conversation is electric. The one thing I got to caution you about, if you go to BourbonCon, can still be some bad news. You might be praying to the porcelain gods there, so watch out. And it's the word's getting around. It's not our little secret anymore. So 3 years ago, Derby sold out in 3 weeks. This year it was 12 hours. That kind of excitement is unbelievable. But it's so well deserved. So when Dave asked the question before, how many people are here for their first time? Who's here for the first time? This crowd, the way that we bring this crowd in is by welcoming them. Welcome to the family. You're in for a treat. So rather than try to explain how awesome Derbycon is, we thought we'd show you a little video, a different video from last year.
Derbycon 5, how was it? I have to say, this is the tiredest I've ever been in my entire life, and I've been through a couple wars, so it's a good testament to the party that everybody was in. And you can feel it, going downstairs, everybody's talking to each other, everybody's socializing with each other. I mean, more so than I think I've ever seen it before. We've had more participation in everything that we go through, and it just felt like it was one big happy family, and that was really cool to see. So thanks again for coming out, and that was really fun. So appreciate it. But CTF was great. We're improving every year. We're getting better at the networking pieces. But here's the final scores. Cult of the Glowing Rectangle Star has gotten first place. Can you folks come up here real quick?
We had a huge team this year, and it was an awesome competition. Everybody did an excellent job, but we thought that with all the work we put in, we couldn't have it. So there was, I don't know where Johnny is, we thought that this should go to HFC. And so can we do that now, or should we, is that okay?
So, ladies and gentlemen,
due to the kindness and generosity of that CTF team that won the CTF. So they worked their buns off only to donate the fruits of their labor back. And if that doesn't exemplify unity and just being in the right place with the right people at the right time, I don't know what does. That's bloody awesome. So thank you. And give them a big hand, please. You know, you ever go to Burning Man and when you walk in they give you a hug and go, welcome home? Well, hello. So anyway, I have a black badge. $1,000. $1,500. Who'll give me $2,000? Who'll give me $3,750? Going one? I've got $3,750. I have $5,000 from the man with the porn stash. Are you shitting me? Wait, stop. It costs $6,000 to run the hackerspace for an entire year. Let's make it happen. Talk. $6,000. We have the hackerspace for an entire damn year off one item. Off one item. What? Give me his bid. What does he have? I have $67.50. Does anybody else care to add to her bid? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to a conclusion after hours of wrangling, argument, discussion, debate. We have decided, and this is Dave, that we are giving for the princely sum of $7,000. They're each going to get a black badge, and we're going to run the hackerspace for 2+ years. You are a goddess among women.
So I see some cult of the glowing rectangle sitting down there. Let's give them a hand. So those badges, they went for $7,000 each. And in case math isn't your strong point, that's not a frugal attempt to get the next couple years of Derby for free. That's 47 years of tickets. I can't even imagine what we're going to be doing in 47 years, but I'm sure that Derby is going to be epic. Dave, no pressure there. So from that auction and the generosity of people like this in this room, the hackerspace in Uganda was covered for over 2 years. So we're not just getting blackout drunk here, we're actually changing the world. This is humbling. Now, another thing that makes Derby really unique is the active focus on defensive talks. You know, who here is involved in the defensive side of things? So blue teaming, rocking a pen test, helping your customer figure out how to clean up. It's like most of us in this room. And at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, we want every attendee to come and they leave better prepared than when they came. It's not much good when somebody comes and sees this great exploit, then they got to go back to work on Monday and say, I don't know, it looks cool, I've got no idea how to fix this. So talks that when they just go in and they talk about 2 minutes of lip service to the blue team at the very end, that's not changing the world. So here's the thing, defense is hard. People like Dan, they know this. So Dan Kaminsky, he warped the fabric of space-time in 2008 when he broke DNS. But he'll be the first to tell you that breaking DNS itself, that was like the easy part. You know, relatively, of course, right? He came from this great background of security, great background of DNS. But when I was talking to him about it, he said, you know, from the minute I had a hunch that this was possible, it took me about a weekend of messing around and playing around, and I finally got an exploit. So a weekend, hard work. He then spent the next 8 months working with the whole industry, trying to figure out how to securely disclose this, how to work on it. From then on, he spent the next 8 years active on education and working with the community. So he has spent far, far more time on the defensive aspect to that groundbreaking research in 2008 than he ever did breaking things in the first place. And so he just keynoted Black Hat this year, so things are working out okay for him, I think. So, not to sound cheesy, but if you've been here for a couple of times, you're the ambassador to this wonderful world that we call Derby. Those first timers that they raise their hands, reach out, let them feel welcome, bring them part of the family. So speaking of feeling welcome, Jeffrey and I are a long way from home. We're from a little startup in Seattle that you might have heard about. So how many of you have interacted with Microsoft Security Response Center for some sort of response or anything like that? So for some of you, it might have been a frustrating experience. For some of you, maybe not. This is a great example, actually. So James Forshaw has been a great collaborator with Microsoft, won $100,000 off of an exploit. Bacillus, as part of the Blue Hat Prize, won $200,000 on a defensive mitigation idea. So Microsoft very, very much values the work with researchers. That point about the Blue Hat Prize, if you have ideas on what things can be done to secure the industry, secure products, secure Microsoft, we're all ears. Reach out on Twitter, reach out on whatever. Microsoft, you're not going to have a hard time finding us out there. So Jeffrey and I, we work on Windows Center, Windows Server, System Center, Azure Stack. So we don't obviously represent all of Microsoft, but we thought we'd give you an insight into the way that we think about security, and not coincidentally, it really represents and it mirrors the way that security is thought about across a lot of Microsoft. So one of the most complicated things when you start talking about security issues is the distinction between security boundaries. You've got security features, and then you've got tradecraft. So this year at DEF CON, Joshua Drake, he goes by JDuck, gave a great talk on how to improve your vulnerability research. He's also speaking later on today, by the way, about stage fright, so you might want to check that out. So JDuck has ample experience with CVEs and stuff, but one of the things that really struck me when he was talking about his early time in the industry was this friend he had, and he would always come running to him and say, hey, look, I found a new vulnerability, I found a new exploit. And his friend would set him aside and say, you know, it's not really. Here's the way to think about it. The question is, what did you have, and what did you get? There's another rule of thumb, I like to call it the axiom of choice. And so, once you've got a situation, could you have accomplished the exact same thing in a bunch of different ways? If so, it's probably not a security boundary. So a great example, if you cause $1,000 of damage after breaking into a house and smashing a TV, the TV isn't the vulnerability there. You had a bunch of... So some of this stuff, it sounds really obvious when you lay it out this way, but it can get pretty complicated when you start talking about it in the real world. AV is a great example. AV, they love to talk about every new ransomware attack that they see that uses PowerShell. And the reason they do this is because they literally can't keep up with the plain old stuff that's just plain old exes getting downloaded. But they also do this because we as a community, we encourage it, we blog it, we tweet about it, we talk about it, and then the next their PowerShell problem. They don't seem to ask how to solve their C++ problem or their darn x64 problem. I don't get it, but they just don't. So let's talk about the anatomy of one of these malware attacks that uses PowerShell, really what it ends up doing. Almost always, you get an end user, double-clicks on a doc or an Excel file. You know, I saw one of those things on my desktop the other day. I don't know if you noticed. So let's talk through one of these things. So they double click on the document. Those things are, they got to enable macros and run the macro. That stuff can be pretty convincing. So this isn't a slam at all on users themselves. But from that point, you're running VBA, so that's Visual Basic for Applications, and that's a real programming language as ugly as you might find it. It's got the full capabilities. It can run Win32 APIs, COM objects. It's got a huge library of stuff it can do. I've seen a OS PE loader written completely as a VBA macro. It loaded the bytes off disk, did the relocations, all that kind of stuff with just VBA. So this is a real programming language. But these bad guys using PowerShell for their macros, what they'll end up doing more often than not is spawning PowerShell.exe to run a crappy little script that goes off to a C2, downloads an exe, and runs the exe. Like, honestly, you didn't get anything there by using PowerShell. VBA has the ability to go off to a C2, download an exe. And even when people use PowerShell, it's pretty famous for its ability to be kind of cunning in its use of the ability to call Win32 APIs. But this malware that uses PowerShell, well, it could have called those Win32 APIs from VBA directly. So what would JDuck's friend tell these AV vendors about all these PowerShell exploits? Starts off, what did you have? Well, you had arbitrary code execution. You could have written a PE loader. And what did you get after using PowerShell? Well, you kind of got some more arbitrary code execution, so you didn't really cross any sort of security boundary there. So this is kind of like the InfoSec equivalent of a tautology, just saying the same thing in different words. Like, here's a good example. Please prepay in advance. I don't know if you can see the little graffiti in there, and they're like there's any other way to pay. So you notice there it does point out this is bad form, so take note. So Dave Hall puts it really well. PowerShell's the original point of attack was never PowerShell. No one ever says this. So, we got a traditional security boundary, and these are the things that survive full frontal assault by an attacker. And it's something you can use for your own security guarantees. So you've got authentication on Windows, you've got your traffic management via firewalls, you've got the HT access in Apache. Like, these are things that are protecting you from attackers. So these are fundamental elements, and they're going to get patched immediately. But the one thing that's missing so often when people talk about security boundaries is they do it without context. So when people say, this protects you, this is like a meaningless sentence. What does it protect you from, right? Like, context is critical. Your web browser, it protects you from visiting a malicious web page. The file permissions on your OS, they protect you from an unauthorized non-administrator accessing that file. So PowerShell's execution policy, we probably all heard about it, but that's a great example where the bunch of the industry has failed to talk about context there. So think about chmod on Unix, right? Chmod on Unix protects you from accidentally running scripts. The execution policy in PowerShell is exactly the same thing. It protects you from accidentally running a script. It doesn't protect you from an attacker taking over your machine with arbitrary code execution and managing to run PowerShell code.
Yeah, that's why we explicitly added a value bypass so that no one would confuse it with the security policy, and yet still.
Right. And, we're thinking about making a change to say, maybe bypass was too subtle, so maybe it's like, dash, what part of not a security boundary do you not understand? Like, so we're working on it. We'll see how that goes. Open source PowerShell, you guys can submit a PR.
Yes, please.
So one of the places that can really start to feel muddy, though, is security features. So a security boundary represents this thing that's going to get patched and stuff. But a security feature represents something that can help you with security, but maybe it's not designed for full frontal attack. So maybe a feature is great at blocking certain forms of attack, or it's great at increasing the cost of an attack. Those are great examples. AV, I think, is the best example of a maligned security feature. So AV could be Maybe it's just useless. Maybe it's actively evil, destroying everything in sight except for the thing it should.
I love this video because you see Nicolas Cage is trying to destroy the attackers. He misses completely and kills all the buildings and people in them.
So like AV is like clearly not perfect, and it's barely even a fight for many people. If an attacker wants to do something, they're going to get past AV, and they're generally not going to have to wait for long. So AV vendors, like they're always trying to make their products more robust, but an AV bypass isn't going to earn a CVE, right? So that said, AV saves the hundreds of millions of computers every year from being compromised. Generally, it's, again, like after a user downloads some malware, runs a Word doc or something like that. So consider some data from the latest Microsoft Security Intelligence Report. So this has been around for years. It's a great, great source of data. So every quarter, 20% of computers encounter malware. And I don't mean like the kind of naggy stuff like, oh, there was a tracking cookie. I mean like, this is a known thing. So actual malware that AV protects them from. So that's over 100 million users every year that are not getting compromised that otherwise absolutely would have. So tradecraft, that's what people do when they're talking about, when you've got that axiom of choice. You've got your choice of tools, techniques, practices, quality of life, all these kind of things. That's where tradecraft comes in. So good tradecraft gives you talks at a place like this. Bad tradecraft brings you into like the Virus Total Hall of Shame or something. I don't know what it is, but pretty bad. So this distinction between security boundaries and security features, this can start to be the source of a lot of frustration if you're reporting an issue in a security-like mechanism, but then you're told that it's not a security boundary. And it's easy to think that this whole like not a security boundary response means it's like the end of the conversation, but it's not. It can be the start. This set of things that aren't security boundaries but still have resulted in collaboration, that's been some of the source of some of the richest stuff we've seen in collaboration with this industry. So you can imagine a thing like this causing hard feelings, right? Pwn to own, down go all the browsers. It's obviously not comfortable, like you never want to see your baby hurt like that, but especially in volume, this kind of research really, really helps companies and products understand areas that they can focus on. Here's a great example this year from Matt Miller and David Weston. They gave a talk at Black Hat. So in 2003, you got an O-Day. You found a buffer overflow, you overwrote a return address, call it a day. Good party. 2016, you need to bypass ASLR, DEP, control flow guard, sandboxing, keep spray mitigations, code integrity, child process policies, like this list goes on. The cost for exploits has gone so much higher in the last 10 years that it's ridiculous. It's now often to the domain of severe, severe expertise and nothing you're going to do on a weekend just for fun. The whole point here is that collaboration has been the key. So perhaps like the most one-sided example I can think of of collaboration I've seen is somebody saw this tweet, forwarded it to us. So the person originally thought that they had found their way into their Surface RT tablet, had fun with that, but in fact we realized that this was an issue in Secure Boot as a whole. And so we finally reached out to them, started working with them, and we started patching this underlying thing as part of MS 16100 in early August. So I think that's like a great example of when you've got a great collaborative community, everybody cares, everybody wants to bring things together. This guy didn't know though that we were running the nano server bug bounty at that point. And so this finding was actually in scope of that bug bounty, and we let him know with a $9,000 check. So like that kind of engagement, that's the way that it was reported wasn't ideal, but we are committed to actively working with people and having that community work together has gone a long, long way of making things better.
Right. So you might recognize this guy. This guy's Dave. He's kind of a dreamer. Yes, these are unapproved slides. So before he had darkened the hallways of Louisville with us, he gave a talk at Derbycon talking about, oh my God, he discovered PowerShell, which was awesome, right? However, that talk was in 2010. So Dave, really smart guy, not the quickest learner. Okay, so after that, right, so now PowerShell adoption, since that PowerShell adoption has just been exploding, right? It's really used by everybody, right? It's used by IT professionals, it's used by the DevOps community, it's used by coders, it's used by intrusion detection people, it's used by forensics. It's just used everywhere. And in case you're not up on recent events, it's even used by Unix admins now. That's right. We've now open sourced PowerShell and made it available on Mac OS, on Linux. So it's available everywhere. So indeed, if you're ever curious about how PowerShell does something, you can just go to the GitHub repo and take a look at the code itself. If you don't like that code, change it. Issue a pull request. We are accepting pull requests from the community, and in fact, we even have community committers to certain portions of PowerShell. So, it really is an open thing. This is a new Microsoft, so encourage you to join that. Okay, so, increasingly though, we've seen a number of PowerShell post-exploitation frameworks, right? Now, when I say post-exploitation framework, it's very important to note that nothing resembling a security boundary was harmed in the making of this framework, okay? Right? So at some point, somebody got this phishing email. It looked like it came from their boss's private email address. It referred to the project they were working on. It referred to their coworkers and said, I need you to review this document immediately. And he double-clicked on it, and then something bad happened. It just didn't seem to go right. So there was some phishing attack. They owned that guy, and then once they own it, they had some ability to do some other stuff. Or a server was hacked with a SQL injection attack. Again, now all of a sudden you have arbitrary code execution, and you can do anything you want. You can run Lua, you can run Python, you can run C++. But at some point, quality of life and quality of work matters. So you choose PowerShell, right? Because that's just where all the goodness is. And you choose PowerShell, and then you decide, well, I'm going to go do some wonderful stuff, right? So this is, post-exploitation toolkits is really the quintessential axiom of choice, or quintessential example of the axiom of choice, right? These bad guys, right, they could go from patient zero to domain admin long before PowerShell. And they could do it without PowerShell, right? So that has nothing to do with it. But once you have arbitrary code access, you can do anything you like. By the way, I love this one example here. What does it say? Pwn shell for bitch-ass admins that try and block our PowerShell candy. You just got to love that, right? So anyway, with this proliferation of toolkits, right? These exploitation toolkits, right? There's Invoke Mimikatz, PowerSploit, PS Attack, PowerShell Empire, Pwn Shell, Social Engineering Toolkit. There's just a ton of these things, right? And so at some point you might say, boy, maybe these things cause some hard feelings. And I'll have to admit that when I first saw these things, I was really kind of taken aback. It's like, oh my heavens, what have I done? I've unleashed this force of evil upon the world. These post-exploitation toolkits, that's like, they're packaging and the evil for everyone to accept, right? And so, it took me a while. I sort of had mixed feelings about it. But again, right, we know you have your post-exploitation tool of choice. So yeah, any business is good business, right? However, at the PowerShell European Conference this year, Matt Schroeder was given a talk about PowerShell Empire, And all of a sudden, I had an insight, right? It became clear to me. I had this moment of clarity. And that moment of clarity made me a strong advocate of these toolkits. And that moment of clarity was conversation with the audience around, hey, isn't this evil stuff? And what I realized was that there is true security, and then there's hope fueled by ignorance. Okay? There's true security, and there's hope fueled by ignorance. And the thing was that these post-exploitation toolkits shatter that hope with knowledge. Okay? And that's a good thing. Okay? It shatters that hope with knowledge. Now, what you're left with is fear, confusion, even despair. But you have clarity about where you are, and you have clarity about the need to act. And that's all good stuff. Okay? So, the red team did not need any of these frameworks to go from, as they say, patient zero to this. They could do whatever they want. And so we're very friendly to these post-exploitation toolkits, and we're going to encourage them, right? And if they help people discover their bad practices, like finding out that they have 3,000 domain administrators because they were sloppy with their security group management, then this is all good stuff. Now, we got to talk about Snowden, okay? A lot of you think the guy's a traitor. A lot of you think the guy's a hero. Not going to get into that. But I'm going to tell you this. The reality is that he's had a substantial effect on the security ecosystem. Okay? So Microsoft had already been committed to a recommitment to security with our Trustworthy Computing version 2. We were already down that path. But after the Snowden revelations, it was an issue of saying, yep, we're in, and here's how much I'm going to invest, to, yep, I'm in, here's how much I'm going to invest. Because the reality is, while everyone was committed to security, and that's really true, it really is, the reality is that when, security researchers would come and talk to us and say, this is possible or this is possible, with these sort of exotic exploits, a number of us would say, well, that's true, but perhaps that's better solved with another layer of tin foil for your hat. I just love that cat. Is that the most awesome cat in the world? Anyway, what Snowden made clear was that these esoteric attacks were not only feasible, they were in practice today. Okay? Now, I know a number of you will say, hey, listen, bad stuff. Snowden was talking about the righteous, hacking of a sovereign nation state for the betterment of our national interests. And okay, fine. But the reality is he was pointing about true vulnerabilities and the fact that exploiting them were feasible, and so maybe they're being exploited by our national intelligence agency, but guess what? They're being used by the other national intelligence agencies as well, and from there, it's just a matter of time before the criminals are using the same exploits, and from there, the script kiddies. Okay? So this was a really big difference. Now, again, the conversation had already been going on, but really these revelations changed the scope, the magnitude, and the intensity of our investment in security. Windows 10, Windows Server 2016, PowerShell version 5, and lots of other things are substantially more secure because of the Snowden revelations. Okay? And we're also taking a much more mature approach to this, right? And this had really started before the Snowden revelations, but again, it really drove home the need to take a more mature approach. So in addition to hardening our systems, we're paying a lot of attention to this assume breach mindset. Assume the bad guys are in, what are we going to do about it? How am I going to find them? How am I going to disrupt them? How am I going to mitigate and repair from the attacks? Now, with all this stuff, right, the security bugs, the nation states, post-exploitation toolkits, you might, think you fall into the pit of despair. In fact, that was me a couple of years ago. But in reality, I think that's the wrong way of viewing it. In fact, recently, I have switched from being a security pessimist to being a security Optimist. Okay? So let's step back a second and talk about spam. I don't know if you can recognize that. That's actually spam sushi. Apparently that's a thing. So the horror. Anyway, so the early days of email, you'd open up your inbox and you'd just be flooded with all the spam, right? Offers to make certain body parts smaller and other parts larger. And just, in fact, it was in 2004 that Bill Gates said, in 2 years, spam will be solved. You remember that? Remember that? 2004. Bill Gates, 2 years, spam will be solved. Now, Bill's a smart guy, but I don't know if you recall, in 2006, spam was not a solved problem, right? It was going pretty strong. In fact, if it weren't for an unfortunate mishap in a wire transfer from Nigeria, I'd be sitting on a beach in Turks and Caicos instead of talking to you. So, unfortunate there. Anyway, so now fast forward, and today, 12 plus years later, it doesn't really seem like a big issue. I mean, I'll occasionally get a random piece of mail, but it largely seems like a solved problem. And so what happened? And one of the answers is that there's large vendors, right, Outlook, Gmail, Yahoo, that represent the bulk of the email addresses in the world. They're like over 30%. So what that means is that when a spammer goes and sends out spam, 1,000 pieces of spam, over 350 of these are going to be caught, are going to be destined to one of these guys, one of their addresses. And what that does is it gives these vendors a clarity as to the patterns and practices, right? They get a global perspective around what's going on. And these vendors have dedicated teams, full-time teams, dedicated to battling spam, okay? So what that means is when a spammer tries a new technique, you've got teams on this, Johnny on the spot, solving this, addressing this, counterattacking against this, before any of us have the opportunity to open up our spam assassin configuration file, right? And so this is a shift from individuals dealing with spam to teams, dedicated, specialized teams dedicated to spam. This is roughly equivalent of going from this guy on the left, right, the Minuteman, full-time farmer, part-time warrior, right, to the guys on the right here, dedicated Navy SEALs, right, one of those awesome lethal forces the world has ever seen, okay? And so the interesting thing about this is that it parallels many of the things we're seeing in the InfoSec community, right? I don't think that spam or security are ever going to fall into the domain of solved problems, but I think we're on the verge of being able to say that at some point we can now see line of sight to the day when these bulk, untargeted, unsophisticated attacks are in the past, okay? So as with spam, I think it all first starts with specialization, right? I can just imagine this guy saying, no, honey, I am not going to pay money for a pest control professional. I could do this on my own. Okay, I just love that video. Anyway, so now... Okay, so one of so it starts with specialization, and specialization in a couple different ways, both people and in code. The reality is most of the systems we use today are cobbled together systems of general purpose components, right? You have a general purpose operating system. What do? You put a bunch of stuff on there, you change a bunch of stuff, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. You run that then on what? On a general purpose networking. It can do anything. And you've got this arbitrary operations model where sort of anybody can do anything at any time. Is it any surprise that we have some problems? Okay. Now what kind of led me to my optimism was this shift towards more crafted solutions. Indeed, microservices. The heart of a microservice is to replace things that we used to do through DLLs, API calls, and we now do through protocols. And by doing it through protocols, we can do that now because of the great advances in networking. And because we can do that, what that means is I can now take that code and run it in its own dedicated environment. So what that means is then I know exactly what should happen in that environment. Okay? And you'll see we've got a bunch of things that we're supporting in that, but here's sort of the general concepts, right? so that you want to be able to have just enough operating system. Instead of having everything, you have just the components necessary to run that piece of code. Microsoft's done that now with NanoServer. Anybody seen NanoServer? That's something I've been spending a lot of time on. Server, just so you get the focus, right? Server in a desktop, that's SAD, server in a desktop, because it makes me sad. Anyway, server in a desktop is about a 9 to 10 gigabyte VHD. Server core is about a 5 gigabyte VHD. NanoServer, 480 megabytes. 480 megabytes. This thing starts in a VM at about 2.5 seconds. It is a new Windows server, I'm telling you. It's awesome. Anyway, so then you just add the components that you need, right? You want to have just enough software. So you put just the software necessary to accomplish a task, and then you use technologies like Device Guard and Windows Server containers so that that's the only code that's going to run in that. You have just enough networking, where you use firewalls and network ACLs to say, hey, I know exactly who that guy should be talking to and what it should be talking to. And so you lock everything else down, right? Just in time and just enough administration. Again, on that machine, I know what you should be doing. And we have techniques now to say those are the only things you do, and here's the only time that you can do them. And then ultimately, version controlling everything, right? With a DevOps workflow now and this model of immutable infrastructure, you put everything in version control, you deploy that, you iterate rapidly, and if everything goes wrong, it goes back and you can find out who did what and why. Okay? So it's this world of specialization. Okay? Now, these techniques have been around for a while. Various flavors, but they've been around for a while. And the reality is that very few people are actually taking advantage of these things to build great software and great secure software. So maybe my optimism is unfounded. But here's why I don't think it is. And that is the cloud. Okay? The cloud. The cloud is all about microservices. Okay? So there's, whether it's Amazon S2 or Microsoft Blob, each one of these vendors has a rich set of microservices. Okay? And even there, one of the microservices tends to be a worker role, where you don't even use IaaS, infrastructure as a service, where you have a VM and do whatever you want to with it. Instead, you give us the code you want to run. We'll take that code, we host it in our environment. We keep that environment always patched, always up to date, etc. And then that little piece of code then calls each one of the microservices. So in fact, a modern application environment is taking advantage of this already. Okay? But now here's where it gets exciting, right? And here's where it gets exciting. What's exciting is that each one of these microservices hosted by the cloud vendors has their own team of like Navy SEALs, right? These guys are full-time people who are dedicated. Their careers are on the line to make sure that service is available and secure, okay? And the cloud vendors like Microsoft, AWS, we have full-time red teams constantly drilling against these people, looking for flaws, pointing out those flaws, and they're constantly getting better, okay? So basically we're shifting from this world of like global, anything can happen, I don't know what good is or bad is, to this world where I know exactly what should be happening, right? But if you think about it, perhaps the most important advance is not just this, but the global perspective afforded by the cloud operating system, right? That is to say, now we're running lots of people's environments, lots of people's code, and we can see the patterns and practices of what's going on, okay? So we have something called Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, right? And what this does is it takes a look at the system and gives you a dashboard, right? Now this dashboard looks like any dashboard you've seen in any number of products, but there's a real key distinction. When you drill into one of the panels and you take a look at a file and you right-click on it, what you can get is a report upon the worldwide use of that file, okay? Because we have this global perspective. So if you look at some executable and you find out, well, Word just dropped this on your system, this executable, and it's only been seen one time in the entire world, you might want to pause before running that, right? Because chances are maybe you're under an attack, right? So the point is that we have professional teams that look at this global perspective. Now, you could say, well, I'd like to do that myself, but you don't have that global perspective. So all that stuff you want to eventually get around to, the stuff around, threat intel sharing, IOC analysis, ADP attribution, right? All those things, guess what? They're really, really hard. Machine learning. Oh, I'd love to do machine. If I had machine learning and I could take a look at the logon patterns, I could detect abnormalities. Guess what? Really, really hard. Has anybody actually tried to stand up their own big data system? Oh my gosh, that thing's hard, right? Really, really hard. So why not take advantage of the big guys, right? The big guys are doing this today, and you can take advantage of it. So again, one of the reasons why I'm optimistic. Now, a lot of people will look at this and say, well, hey, I'm not going to send my sensitive data to the cloud. That's bad. They think that they can better protect their data themselves. There's a word for this, right? It's the Dunning-Kruger effect. Basically, it's that thing that says, people are confident because they don't have the competence to know that they're not competent. Anyway, so let's go back and rethink this, right? So 1 out of 10 phishing emails are successful. 1 out of 10, right? So bad guy just needs to send email to 10 of your employees, and guess what? They're in. Our evidence shows us once they're in, it's about 24 to 48 hours before they get domain admin, and from there, they're in. You may never detect them. If you do detect them, it takes on average about 200 days before you detect them. So this concept that, I can better secure my data than the cloud vendor, clearly the facts do not bear out this confidence, okay? Does not bear out this. So again, I think the things will really, I'm very confident of the cloud model. Where I think we're going to see a great shift is when we start to get to this anonymized, commoditized threat sharing model, right? Where, the cloud vendors all play again with each other and say, hey, I see someone's been attacked, I anonymize that information, give that threat signature to the others, and they can share that and protect their customers as well. And this is, you might have heard of this model of the attacker's advantage or the defender's dilemma, right? So the defender's dilemma basically goes like this. The defender has to be right all the time. The attacker only has to be right once, okay? Now, the point is, with this global perspective, we have the opportunity to flip this upside down, okay? Flip it upside down. So now imagine that an attacker attacks somebody, but they're attacking them and they're hosted in the cloud. And that cloud vendor detects that attack, is able to take that information and share it with the rest of the world. Now all of a sudden, one attack, the entire world's put on notice, and now all of a sudden, in the past we talked about burning 0 days. Now all of a sudden you're going to be burning your procedures, your threats, your techniques, and everyone's going to know about it. So the group gets better and can better defend the individuals.
So that kind of security advantage, that kind of stuff is epic. And you might be thinking, well, cloudy cloud stuff, but what about me? Like, what can I personally do? We're in this room, we're trying to make the world a better place. We're all taking different paths to get there, but the ultimate goal is to make things more secure. The other people who aren't in that mind space, they're at home trying to figure out how to make how much ransom a father will pay for the pictures of his children. So whatever, right? So let me tell you a story. It comes from Twitter. There's this little account I follow, and it's kind of a funny irony there. Like, there's a Swift programming language Apple introduced in 2014, and so they somehow marry that with InfoSec. So this InfoSec Taylor Swift. So in 2015, they started getting really interested in ransomware. Then they got emotionally invested. They continued to dig and dig, start to look at the way that ransomware propagates, the way that it actually takes hold. Out of that research, they started locking things down just based on common stuff, like find a thing, take a thing, make a change, right? Started sharing out a pretty cool GPO. Here's another one that's pretty cool. So in PowerShell, we've always associated double-clicking a PowerShell script with Notepad because people make mistakes. This is a GPO that does the exact same thing for JavaScript. Now, as an aside, we talk about the community nature of Derbycon and everything else in this community. Like, it takes zero to take a screenshot, post on Twitter, solve your own problem. Just help somebody else, right? So somebody else now got helped by that little bit of, intelligence. So after a while, some magic happens. Happy days, block some ransomware. And this kind of thing is kind of a funny way of paving the way for future wins. You'd be like, I make a little change, solves a little problem. Make a little change, solves a little problem. And then all of a sudden you've got the ability they'll say, yeah, you made that change, it worked out. Keep on making more changes, you're doing the right thing. If you're thinking that you need to wait for some huge, way up high PO to make a thing happen, you just start pitching in. And you might think that things were happily ever after and everything's all great. Thank goodness, GPO saved the day. But an insidious threat was brewing. Bad days. Bad days. That was I took a look and that was a Friday afternoon, so it wasn't a fun weekend, I'm sure. But in the end, our intrepid hero prevailed, figured out what was happening, made some more changes, and made themselves a better organization for it. So this little thing, what does ransomware and Taylor Swift have to do with us and making the world a safer place? It's somebody realizing that they can make small little changes, one by one, do the boring InfoSec stuff, and make the world a better place. And the funny thing about the creative and engineering process is that it's slow and it's tedious, right? The stuff is boring. So Dan Petro puts this really, really well. So he wrote a Smash Brothers artificial intelligence, and he presented it at DEF CON this year. So avid Smash Brothers is a fighting game, competitive, people make money off of it. Avid Smash Brothers guys will say, you're never going to write an AI for this, there's too much tactics, it's too complicated. So he went home, about 10,000 lines of code, he had one. So this screenshot here, this is showing his AI playing a really weak character against a level 9 computer AI, taking no damage, booting the computer off the screen, and then doing something that no human can do manually, called a multi-shine. It's you gotta be frame perfect on all your stuff you're doing. So it's just trolling, look at what I can do. So you might think that this endeavor was accomplished with just shining brilliance through and through, make an AI, go home and do awesome stuff. But if you hear Dan talk about his experience with this, most of engineering is really hard problems that you bang your head on for hours and days. You solve it, you go, woo! And you're what's next? Bang your head, days on the next one, it sucks, and then woo! So at any point, you talk to this guy, and 99% of the time, he's this sucks, I don't know what I'm doing, I can't make any changes, things are broken. But that's what it feels like to do the hard engineering work. But at the end of the day, you get AI that's beating the world's best players at Smash Brothers. Especially at a conference like this, all we see are the amazing end results. So another great example was Evan Booth, right? So he showed this total MacGyver hand here. You see that? He made it out of a Keurig machine. Opened the box, took it apart with some Dremels and stuff. That's crazy. A Keurig machine out of a hand out of a Keurig machine just for fun. And what you don't see is the 200 hours he spent at his workbench doing all this stuff. You don't see the 8 times he cleaned up. Who wants to clean up? It takes 8 times. So Taylor Swift ransomware is a great example of being empowered, getting stuff done, making one change at a time. It's seeing that you have the opportunity to make a change and just running with it. These are the kind of challenges that they face us every single day. And what makes the real difference in security is us. It's us spending our time tackling these problems one at a time.
Great. So, if you're a people manager, right, you are leadership role, you've got a really great opportunity to encourage this mindset, right? Encourage this mindset of individuals taking time to explore, sharpen their skills, make things better, right? And so the question is, are you doing that, right? Are you creating that environment? Are you creating that culture? Turns out as a manager, you really only have 2 degrees of control, right? One is budget, and the second is culture, right? So let's talk about budget, right? Are you creating, I'm a big fan of spending your budget on people and training first in the area of security. People and training first over projects, over products, right? A lot of people think that they can just throw money at a product and boom, see, security's solved. And that's rarely ever the case, right? So can you shift some of your budget from products to, say, contractors to free your people up, to give them time and space to explore, to experiment, to get trained up, right? If you think about the amazing scripting and remote management capabilities that common operating systems are delivering to people, this gives you incredible leverage if your people know how to use that, right? So you want to invest in your people, right? So Lee did a great thing, right? He went to a search engine and searched PowerShell and used to take me, right? The phrase used to take me. They found these amazing set of examples, right? So some guy had written this automated performance monitoring system that runs every night automatically with something that used to take hours, right? Or there was this invoice automation that just happened, it took a couple minutes when in fact the pass was all manual and took many hours, right? And Lee tells this great story about having talked to this small business that had been affected by malware, infected by malware. And the CIO, a small company, decides, well, I'm going to figure out the scope of my problem. And so he brings up PowerShell and wrote a PowerShell one-liner using Active Directory and the remote scripting capabilities of PowerShell. And in a few short minutes, he knew all the systems that had been affected by the indicators, but showed the indicators of compromise, and then they could begin remediation, right? This is something that, if you had an external engagement, would cost tens of thousands of dollars and have a pretty long lead time. And yet this person was able to just go to their desktop and do it. Why? Because they had taken the time to invest in their skill set and their knowledge. Okay? So what we want to do is we want to, sorry. So as you think about this, as individuals, right, this can seem daunting. Like, what, me? Like it falls to me? And the answer is, yeah, it falls to you, right? And, a lot of us could look at this and be overwhelmed, right? Wait a second. I've got to learn all this stuff. I've got to be the protector. And you can begin to have this imposter syndrome, right? And Alicia Liu said this really well, right? She said, hey, the reality is that there's this world where this perspective where you think, here's what I know, and here's what the other people know. When in fact, it's not that at all. In fact is that you have this domain of expertise, and other people have their domain of expertise. And you just want to chip away at it, learn, be better. Look, here's the reality, right? The reality is, Microsoft has over 100,000 employees. 100,000 employees. Of those, there were only 8 technical fellows working on individual products. Only 8. Last year, I became one of those, right? I suffer imposter syndrome all the time, right? I wake up every day thinking, oh man, at some point they're just going to say, that guy doesn't know what the heck he's doing, and I'm going to be fired, right? This is a very real thing. And so I encourage you to just say, go with that flow, just accept it, and just invest in yourself, right? So if there's something that you've been thinking about doing, right? So at some point I had this idea, PowerShell, and I thought, I don't know, is that the right thing? Is that the wrong thing? If you have one of those, I encourage you to go with it, right? Follow your passion. Give yourself permission to succeed. Sometimes this can be a long, hard row. The example he gave of the guy working on this dozens of times before finally being successful. With PowerShell, it's a very difficult road, right? In fact, to pursue it, I ended up having to take a demotion. I was demoted. It took me 5 years to get my stripe back, but then in the long run, boom, 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 now I'm technical fellow, right? So I encourage you, and by the way, it was very difficult 5 years, But what kept me going was my passion, because I knew that this was a fantastic model, a fantastic idea, and I just went with it, and it ultimately bore fruit. So give yourself the permission to succeed. Invest in yourself, and I think you're going to have a whole lot more fun. You guys rock. This has been a great Derbycon, and enjoy.
Thank you.